stel mij vragen, dan zorg ik dat je meer informatie krijgt. Volgens mij moeten we nu gewoon het belangrijkste onderdeel van de naam.
Dankjewel. So, let me see where so, now it's time for Kevin Crowley. There's a short introduction, but it actually was from the side, so I think it's correct. So, Kevin Crowley is Professor of Learning Sciences and Policy at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's the Director of University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments. That acronym is UPCLOSE. Usually, acronyms are pretty good, so this is for European subsidies. And he works a lot with the museums, community organizations, other informal educators to develop innovative learning environments. This morning we had a very, very interesting discussion. This was actually the reason that we got in contact with him, because we met him for the birthday at the side meeting to talk about learning spaces, because we are renewing our museum completely and we want to discuss his ideas of Kevin and Karen in connection with what we want to do in our workshop space and learning spaces. So thank you very much for coming and
well, you might need 2 minutes. Well, gosh, thanks for having us. We're really quite appreciative to kind of learn about what's going on in the Netherlands. And this idea of ecosystems for learning is one that's right now very hot in the States. So I'm going to just talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing. And I'm totally interruptible for questions, so let's go. And you wanted like 40 minutes of talk and then do some TikTok. Okay. All right, so the work I'm going to present is a joint production by me and Karen Knudsen. Okay, this is a picture. This is a policy document from the United States of America. It is a picture of a pipeline, and it's the way that we most commonly characterize education in the United States. This particular pipeline is for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. And here's what it says. In 2005, we have 4 million ninth graders who enter high school after primary school. By the time that they're ready for graduation, only 2.8 million of the initial 4 million will actually graduate high school. 1.8 of that 2.8 million will plan to attend university, but only 1.3 million will actually enroll in university. So of that 1.3 million, 277,000 will choose to major in STEM, and of that 277, 166,530 exactly will graduate with the STEM degree. So when we talk about STEM workforce, or we talk about education in the United States, we're most often focused on what the economic impact is going to be and how we can set policies in place that will get this little glass that's dripped a little bit fuller. And we talk about education mostly as a problem of schooling. And the problem of schooling is to keep people from dripping out of the pipeline at critical junctures, so that in the end, out of all this raw material, we have what we need as a society to be competitive internationally. So there's a ton of problems with this as a vision of education. To name just a few, you guys are very interested in curiosity. Water droplets are not there at first. They're in the system, and they're just getting pushed through this system. And it's the system that determines whether they stay in or stay out. And once they drip out, they're dead to us. They're gone from the science and engineering pipeline. They go down this drain. I don't know where that drain goes, but we lose sight of those students. And so when we set policies in place, we're often focused on the kind of mathematics we want to get here, how to redo undergraduate education so that it keeps more people in the pipeline. But we very much lost sight of the water, of the raw material, of the people for whom this system is supposed to serve and exist. And the other thing about this system is it rarely recognizes anything that happens outside of formal schooling. The pipeline ignores all of this white space that lives around it. So here's another policy document. It's more, so in this part of the talk, I sometimes say, we also don't understand the dynamics of what goes on in each of those junctures. We forget that kids are alive before they enter high school, and they've learned a lot of interesting stuff. And we also forget, beyond school, there's a whole lot of learning that occurs as people bump into things like science or art or history. And I should just say, I study mostly science education, so my talk will mostly be about science education, but the ideas I'm going to talk about are applicable beyond just science. Okay, so here's another policy document. This came out in 2009 from my National Academy of Sciences, and it's an attempt to reconceptualize education from a pipeline model. This is the pipeline. This orange right here is the percent of your life you spend in school if you grow up in the United States. So 18.5% of your waking hours as you go from grade 1 to grade 12 are in school, 7.7 in university, 5.1 in graduate school, and then every once in a while when you work, you maybe receive some sort of formal training. So this is the pipeline, but what is this deep blue sea that surrounds the pipeline? This is what I'm really going to argue today that we should be focusing on in education. I think it's very consistent with your white paper and your vision for the future. So what's out there? What's out there beyond these organized learning experiences in schools are thousands and thousands of opportunities for you to bump into disciplines in the world and learn something about it. Some of these moments are organized and very supported, like here in the museum. Some of these are completely spontaneous as you walk in the woods or walk through the park. Some of them are semi-structured, maybe something on the web, or maybe you're watching a show about television science on TV. But what it does is it changes our language away from kind of getting here at the beginning down to that little glass at the end to education as a problem. How do we create rich ecologies of learning that support momentum for someone through their life and provide resources so that they can navigate specific pathways? So those three orange words, momentum, resources, and pathways, are, I think, what we're really trying to engineer an education system to achieve. And by momentum, we mean something very similar to curiosity. It's as you go through life, you become more and more invested, interested, and likely to explore something like science when you bump into it. There are resources all around you. There are museums, there are expert facilitators, there are after-school clubs, and there are schools that help you learn something about something like science when you bump into it. And your own path through this ecology is going to be unique. You'll share certain parts of it with other people, but the way that you find your way through this broader set of ecologies is something that you have to construct as you go through life. So it's not a pipeline. It's not even 50 pipelines. It's this broad, diverse set of experiences that we all have to learn how to navigate. And an idea like curiosity is part of what you build. Agency, you build curiosity, awareness of the fact that you're on a pathway and that you have some choice and some agency to choose how you navigate the pathway. So having said that, let me tell you about where we started with this book about 4 years ago. We wanted to know how someone constructs a lifelong learning pathway, so we interviewed 69 scientists and also 30 artists, but I'm just going to talk about the scientists today, about how they got to where they were in the scientific workforce. So this is a picture of a life history diagram. These were about 2.5-hour interviews. And we took people through every part of their life, asking them when they first got interested in science, where did it happen, who were they with, what happened next, and we could construct from that a series of individual pathways for these 69 scientists. And what we found was what you might expect if you know a little bit about the interest literature in early science. 86% of the people who work in science reported a strong early interest about science or science-related activity while they were in grade school. So before they went to middle school or about 11 years old, they already had a strong interest in science. But of that 86%, only 16% reported that they wanted the job of scientist when they grew up. So they didn't want to be a scientist, they didn't identify it as a science thing, they identified it as something else. 28% said they first felt passion for science in school, but about double that reported that they got interested in science and out-of-school science. So what I'm going to tell you about now, if you kind of look at these numbers, they don't yet tell you much about what a pathway would be, what it looks like and feels like while someone is assembling and learning around science. We went through these interviews and we identified 5 starting points in science. And we call these passions. So there's a bit of curiosity here, there's a bit of agency, a bit of skill. It's the place where you begin identifying something that's really important for you in your life. You begin to build your identity around it and really pursue it as an interest in your life. And we found 5 common starting places for science. So some of the people we talked about, the first passion for science came from knowledge. And so these were like the dinosaur kids. You have them here in the Netherlands, right? Right. And so they're like 5 or 6. And there's books and there's museums like this, and they know everything there is to know about dinosaurs. And for them, in particular, they know more for the first time in their lives than their parents know about a topic. And we call these islands of expertise. And on this one thing, on dinosaurs, the kid is suddenly much smarter than a 5-year-old. And they're able to engage in advanced reasoning, and they're able to feel, really, first time, the power of knowledge. And so, in a lot of science education, we focus more on inquiry and process these days, and we kind of overlook the fact that for some people, large, well-organized, categorical, declarative knowledge is a really important piece of their life. So this was about 20% of our sample showed some sort of passion for knowledge. There were also people who had a passion for nature, and this was different than, you told me about this just earlier, you were telling me about your passion for nature. This is different than knowledge of birds or knowledge of beetles. This is a real connection to the land. So we heard some people who talked about growing up on farms and having kind of experiences in vegetable gardens or farming being really important. A lot of people participated in scouting activities or went on family camping trips as well. And so for them, being outside, being connected to nature, learning about nature was the first time that they really felt passionate about science. There's a passion for tinkering that we often identify. Our sample was interesting in that only half of the people in the sample had parents who were college educated. So many of them came from blue-collar backgrounds and were the kind of first generation in their family to go to university to become scientists. And in particular, we heard a lot about tools, being down in the workshop, particularly with Dad, taking apart radios, taking apart televisions, that kind of stuff. And as you might expect, many of these people went on to become engineers, but many of these people also went on to become biologists. It wasn't that they were getting deeply enmeshed in the discipline of engineering by doing this. They were developing a passion really for how things work and how you can change the world with your hands. There were some people, and this is a smaller group, for whom the precision of math, logic puzzles, and problem solving was the first anchor for science. We have a game called baseball in America, and many children have grown up kind of doing statistics. Is there an equivalent then? I mean, you don't do that with soccer. You don't calculate batting averages or anything. Ice skate, okay, of course, lap times and excellent ice skating, right? So you know what I mean. Really, you have ice skating geeks who do that? That's pretty interesting. So for those people for whom the numbers of that and putting numbers around an experience added a new way of looking at the world and a sense of precision. We often heard people say certainty was important in their lives when they started doing this. There was a way to know and a way to quantify was something that they thought was really important. And these are all, remember, kids who are 11 or younger telling us about the early childhood of the science. A passion for medicine and for helping was also something that we heard. So people wanted to be veterinarians, people maybe wanted to grow up to be doctors and nurses, and so for them, biology and intervention in biology was really important when we started. Okay, so those 5 passions are starting places, and I show you this graph well, we can go through a little bit, but just to point out a few things. We interviewed people who were university professors. We also interviewed people who were scientists working in industry or in museums or other settings. And then we also interviewed a set of science communicators. So these were science teachers, science journalists, people for whom science was important, but they don't produce science. And I don't place a lot of faith, particularly in these numbers. I show them to you just to say, here are the 5 passions. And there were different profiles in our samples about passions associated with later careers. And I like this slide because it reminds us, again, that this isn't necessarily a pipeline, but also that we're probably educating for a scientifically literate public and a scientifically literate workforce beyond just the people who are kind of the high-end producers of science. So, in particular, the science educators often had a connection with nature, and that's what kept them coming back to science. The professors were often tinkerers or people who were interested in medicine. What does this mean? I'm not sure. I just think it's kind of an interesting puzzle to remind ourselves that lifelong, it's a different set, perhaps, of experiences that people come to define as science. So I show you this pathway slide again. We were talking to people about here. Our sample had baby boomers, folks born before 1967, 68, and then Generation Xers, folks who were born after that, as we did these passions. And they were looking back and kind of tracing the warm line of their life. And so then now, you guys here in the Netherlands are trying to engineer an ecosystem that doesn't rely on accidents to have people bump into science. So the real issue is how to stand here in the eyes of a learner and look forward and not just see an undifferentiated mess of stuff that they may or may not do. You have to ask yourself, which of these nodes are really important ones that we want to be able to help connect for the largest groups of learners. So this is what you want, and these are the questions, I think, that we have to ask ourselves as we start thinking about designing these learning ecosystems for pathways. The first is, if you're going to do this, you have to give up on the idea that success equals school, right? You're not designing anymore for people to get through school. You're designing for them to encounter science in a really broad variety of ways. It's going to help with school success, but how they do on a particular test is a pretty weak measure of how strong your ecosystem is as a learning ecosystem. So how are you going to define what success looks like in this project? How are you going to intervene at a systems level? And I'll talk a lot about this in a second. This is the single hardest thing. We're used to thinking about programs and institutions as being relatively standalone. So you can change some dials on this program, change some dials on this program, but you're designing a system, and you need to act at a systems level. So where do you find levers in the system that are going to produce this tinkering in just one part of the system at a time can be super counterproductive. You can max maximize it here and then kind of screw up something else. And finally, from an investment standpoint, how would a foundation or a government decide where to place their money and assess whether or not those investments were successful? So I'll tell you one definition of success that we've been developing, and it's an idea that we call science learning activation. So very simply, the idea is all of these early experiences and your later experiences activate you towards science. And what activation is comes a little bit from the work we've done on these interviews from Lit Review, but also we've now done a series of measurement development studies that our colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, and some of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh are doing, that have identified a set of things that we think would be important outcomes for a healthy learning ecosystem. Learners would show developing fascination with science, and this is where curiosity and interest lie. They also would value science as an important cultural and societal achievement. They perceive themselves to have autonomy. They have choice in science. They have agency in science. They believe that they are competent in science, and they have some skill in scientific sense-making. They can think like a scientist, not just believe that they can think like a scientist. And these, for those of you who know a little bit about motivational psychology or science education, you'll recognize in these terms some of the areas we've been studying for 20, 30 years. But what we're proposing is that these don't exist as separate things. They make sense to the individual and are carried by the individual as this broader composite that we call science learning activation. And if you are activated, you are more likely to choose science when you have a choice of things to engage in. You are going to engage more deeply with science. And coming out of that, you'll have learned some of the knowledge and skills that that experience affords you as a learner. And if you do that, our argument is you will be more likely to be successful the next time you bump into science. So our vision is not that each education experience kind of builds a piece of a little scientist in you. We're not kind of putting the mechanical scientist together until he graduates and he's fully scientific. We're trying to give you momentum the next time you bump into science. So anything that fascinates you, makes you value it a little bit more, gives you some more sense-making, will make it more likely that you engage and ramp up in your involvement with science. And this is a good time to say, I'm saying science activation, I don't believe, and this actually is going to be a challenge for your curiosity, I don't believe that activation or curiosity is independent of discipline. One of the things we really learn from the study of passions in neuroscience is you connect a lot of that to particular domains. So we believe that there's an activation for art, there's an activation for history, there's all sorts of ways that you begin in the learning ecology to get oriented towards the disciplines that you're later going to study in school. And so for us, it's really important when we measure this and when we intervene, we do it in the context of authentic science, because that's really where we're trying to activate. So this could have been a whole talk, but I just tried to do it really briefly. But can I just ask, does anyone have questions about this particular slide before we move on? Good? Okay. Yeah, we're good? Okay, good. He's good. Your friend is good? Your skeleton friend is good? He should have raised his hand. Like I was waiting for someone to animate the stuff. Yes, sir. This is really fun. This is intentional, right? Yes, Yuri has a question. I'm not Yuri. Salamita has a question. So, this is a distinction that's technical with respect to the motivation literature, which is why our measurement concept builds it in here. Competency beliefs are pretty simple. You think you're good at it is basically what competency beliefs come down to. Perceived autonomy is more that not only do you think you're good at it, but you are somebody who can choose this. This is a little bit more like identity. I have a choice, I have some agency, and I can do this on my own. So I'm kind of becoming increasingly independent and competent in my pursuit of science. And, if you split theoretical hairs, you get different theories that sit at the bottom of this. These may one day become grouped if our measurement studies suggest that they're not really independent dimensions of activation. And so activation is a theoretical thing for us, but it's also an extremely practical thing because our project was funded by a foundation which had been investing in a lot of different programmatic efforts in the region, and they didn't know if all of these investments were really moving the needle for the region. Was the ecosystem getting stronger, or were just a bunch of programs reporting independently successful results? So this measurement in this theory has been kind of designed so that it could be a measurement that's applied regionally to show whether or not the needle is moving. And we're just trying to get the stuff within this box to align as closely as possible with the learning literature and the education literature. But what we're really interested in doing is figuring out whether something like this, if it exists, if this can be measured and increased through a series of interventions. Okay, so speaking of interventions, how do you intervene in a system like this? And I'll talk about some work that we've been doing in Pittsburgh over the last several years. We are working, this is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we live, and we're working with 4 cultural institutions in the city of Pittsburgh around this idea of an ecosystem for science activation. And so we're defining it as a shared aspiration for the city's children. So what is it that not just individually we want to do, but collectively we're going to achieve in Pittsburgh? It's a research and practice infrastructure for, I call it gardening in the ecology. There's a lot of stuff that exists. You don't have to recreate most learning ecologies. And it's not a top-down problem anyway. You don't just kind of come in to a system and build it from whole cloth. You look at what you have and you garden. You start connecting things, pruning things, fertilizing things. So it's kind of tuning the infrastructure so that it begins to make more of our visions. It's bottom up. It has to come from what the organizations value and what they're doing. And for us, it's really important that whatever work we do has to be measurable through an assessment like the activation organization. We're doing it in Pittsburgh by creating a group of people called Design Fellows. These are people who spend half their time at the university as researchers, and they spend half their time as practitioners out in the world. And they were embedded in a museum, in a community arts group, in an environmental education organization, and in a public library. And so what they were helping do, this is the kind of the problem, the design problem of the ecosystem, is not just one afternoon in a museum or even one summer in a summer camp. It's kind of what piece am I building as part of a larger learning trajectory. And so we use the design fellows to kind of help practitioners step back and say, well, that's great that you're going to do this, but where did they come from? What did they do last summer? Where will they go next summer? And start seeing it more from the learner's point of view as opposed to the organization point of view. So here's some of the stuff we're discovering about why that's hard to do. I don't know if this looks familiar to you guys in the Netherlands, but if you go into any after-school, out-of-school learning environment in the United States, and you're doing something, and then you're a parent and child walking out the door, you will see this. This is a table of random pamphlets that other organizations have dropped off, or this organization has thought, oh, you might like this stuff too. So there's a handmade arcade, it's kind of a maker thing. This is an art group over here. This is a technology summer camp up here. This is a museum pamphlet. So I'm on a pathway. I just had a great learning experience. Where do I go next? You choose. Well, I don't know. What is all this stuff, right? And so we did a study where we had parents sit down and read these pamphlets. And then we asked them what this was about. And we discovered some really interesting things in this study. We discovered, for instance, that mostly we, the learning organizations, write these pamphlets for ourselves. They're like, hey, look at all this great stuff. You could do robotics, you could do Scratch, you could do all these things. And the parent reads that and says, I don't know what Scratch is. I know my kid likes robotics. That's on the other side of town. Where does it say how much it costs? So they don't really understand where they're supposed to go. And really, how could anyone understand? Because from a design perspective, this is how we often treat continuity. So one problem we have to solve, and it's not going to be an easy problem, is how to think about ourselves as part of collective impact on someone's pathway. What it means is we're not all going to be able to run large programs that attract large audiences. Another thing we've done is catalog and then analyze all the environmental education programs, out-of-school environmental education programs in Pittsburgh. And what we discovered, 80% of them are experiences for beginners. And then there's about 18% for people with a little bit of experience, and then there's like a very small percentage for people who are really advanced. And if you think about it, it makes sense. No one wants to design a program where they have to tell someone, yeah, this is for kids who are advanced. They want to take everyone who comes. So they tell the same stories over and over. And they do the same things over and over. So you can learn how to measure water quality 25 times in Pittsburgh. And it's all interesting and different, but if you were someone who really was beginning to develop a passion around nature, you don't just want to do the same thing over and over. You want to start being connected to different people, to different organizations, to different locations in the city. So you have to design pathways that go somewhere, which means somebody is going to have to decide to specialize in different parts of the pathway. Also, audiences. Pittsburgh is a city, like many, that is very geographically broken up. We have bridges, we have rivers. It's quite beautiful. You should visit this. We're often told it looks like a European city. Which one do they always say it looks like? Thanks. Thanks for helping out with the joke. Jesus. San Francisco looks like a European city too, right? Anyway, if you came, not Boston, no, it's like maybe Prague, is that how it is? It has more bridges than Venice. Yeah. So, what? So what happens with all those bridges, though, is that it creates very, very geographically isolated neighborhoods. And it's not unusual in Pittsburgh for kids to never leave, particularly kids who are in distressed neighborhoods, never leave their neighborhood. And a lot of the community organizations want to keep the kids in the neighborhood. They don't want the kids to get kind of shipped across town to the museum. They want to build it and strengthen the neighborhood. So it's really hard to get people to think about bringing diverse audiences to different parts of the city. So we have a natural history museum in the cultural district. That's never going to be recreated in a small neighborhood. So those kids eventually, if they're on a pathway, are going to have to leave the neighborhood and come in to the cultural district. And they'll have to feel welcomed. They don't want to show up there and see a lot of kids who don't look like them. They don't want to hear a lot of people talking in language that they feel uncomfortable with. So that's a problem of getting people to really see the system. That problem exists, perhaps even more so. It's hard for parents and children to see the pathway. It's also really hard for teachers to see the pathway. So one of the other programs we did, this is with the Environmental Education Organization. These are all logos of different out-of-school groups that were part of this effort, is to convene a conversation about educators and then develop some tools that help educators know what's happening on the environmental education pathway. So what tools does a teacher have if they notice a kid who's interested in something? What tools does an informal educator have if they think the kid had a good experience and they want to recommend to them where they should go next? So they become concierges or ambassadors for the system. And those people are really important. And they need to be spread out all over the city at the critical areas where those audiences that you want to attract. And they need to have a voice. They're not just told what the pathway is. They're connected to and concerned with these organizations, with those schools, so they have to be able to co-construct what our pathway is doing. And finally, and I think this is my last slide, from an investment perspective. So this is where, so how many pathways should you support? Well, this is our best guess. There aren't hundreds, but there's more than 5. And this is for science. So the 5 passions that we identified, you might say, these are pretty good pathways, and I would agree with you. And they're pathways that build the passion organically. They're not about, oh, you like nature, so you must have to be a biologist. A lot of people go on from nature to other kinds of science. So for Pittsburgh right now, I think we're conceptualizing, and I say we're part of a much larger collaborative groups that are doing this, but we're conceptualizing maybe 12 to 15 pathways for STEM in Pittsburgh. And we're really right now, we have a lot of robotics work, so there's going to be a pathway or 2 that makes use of those resources. We have a lot of concern with water quality. In Pittsburgh, we have a very bad combined sewage overflow problem. And so some of those pathways are going to be about ecological stewardship and water. And it kind of reflects what we're good at and what we care and what we value. And that's, I think, how you do it. You grow it up around what you're able to support. But there couldn't be hundreds, right? In a kind of wild ecology where people just by accident find their way to science, there can be hundreds. But if you want to make that less accidental and more intentional, you will have to make decisions. And that means picking winners and losers, which is extremely difficult. Like we try, hey, let's collaborate, let's all work together. We're not saying, let's all work together, and that means some of us are going to have to change how we work. That's a really hard message to carry to the world of practice. Parents, children, and educators need tools to navigate. It's not a website with a series of lists. It's certainly not a table of pamphlets. How can we build some semi-intelligent tools that begin to catalog children's experiences and help them find the next thing in the ecology? I know you're thinking about portfolios. Could a portfolio be smart and kind of guess what the next step is? Beginning, middle, and advanced experiences, on-ramps to the ecology everywhere. You need to not just start at a museum, you need to start in the neighborhoods and build towards a place like a museum. And finally, I'll end by just reinforcing this idea that it's really hard for organizations because what used to be a museum like the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh would think about what it was doing in education and outreach as building experience. And rightly so. They want people to come to the museum, to use the museum, so it's a vertically integrated model. We'll get you when you're 5, and then you'll come in when you're 8, and then you learn about it. And eventually you'll bring your kids and grandkids back. So it's all about connecting you to me, the organization. If I'm going to work my butt off to bring you into the museum and then send you across town to another museum, what's my incentive for doing that? There really needs to be kind of a regional redesign set of values, and funders need to be a lot smarter about how they categorize success for people to actually want to be. There needs to be trust if there's going to be collective impact. And it's also just hard from a design perspective, even if you could get over the trust issue, how to think about figuring out where your kids came from. They're not just blank sites. They have experience. So how do you figure that out in the first few days of the program? How do you build from that? And then how do you shape their experience so that they are thinking about what they're going to encounter the next time down? So it really is seeing at least a few steps on the path behind you and in front of you if you're really going to give people momentum when they come through the moment in your this. Okay, that was my last slide. So thank you very much. As I said, Karen and I are super appreciative to be able to come and learn about this initiative. And really, are we doing questions? So the passions, definitely, you could have more than one. We never saw anyone in our little sample of 69 who had over 5, but we saw lots of 2s, and I think we saw a few 3s. And it's not always the same. You sometimes lose passion. So in some parts of your life, nature might be important, knowledge becomes important later. You're right, it would be a mistake from a theoretical standpoint to think about it as linear. And people keep coming back, but from a design standpoint, the branches can't be infinite. And so that part of it, I think, is where it's going to be a really difficult educational challenge. Because at some point it has to be linear, because I have to have designed a support for you, but linear toward what, and linear for who, and all of that seems really challenging to me right now. Because once you feel that it's a pipeline, and you have no choice, that will violate maybe the very thing that makes you passionate about. And I do want to say also that passion, once established, I like to think about it as having long-term consequences for you. So a lot of times when we talk about interest in the informal world, people come in the museum, they're going to get excited, they're going to think you're liable. Then when they get to school and study science, and our story about their interest and excitement isn't going to stop, because then they're in school. But passion is really important because you encounter lots of challenges. We have case studies we're working with women in science who encountered all sorts of obstacles that become that you'd expect in the pathway. But because they were passionate, they were able to go back to their love of science as a resource. So it's even less linear. It's not even linear in time necessarily. How I think about the impact of something like passion. So I think we'll figure out by trying to build this stuff and see what works.
Anybody else?
We need to have a sustainable learning ecosystem. So, how many organizations do we need
It'll be different for each region, but part of what I'm really interested in, I think some other groups are also working on this, is metrics that would answer your question, what does a healthy ecosystem feel like? And it's definitely not a monolith, right? You couldn't have everything kind of predictable by pathways. But that's a really interesting question. How do you even conceptualize what needs to be strong? The idea of like critical mass. At what point would it get in that critical mass to be sustainable? I don't know. But that's why it's kind of an interesting experiment you're engaged in, because you didn't ask the question like how to perfect those tools. You're asking a real interesting systems question, which is how to build something that's going to have value, even if it's doing something we're not sure what's going to do now. So the ecosystem perspective, I think, will change investment strategies if there's enough funders who have faith in the idea before there's evidence to show that this relatively long-term effects are happening. It's a great question.
I have a question about the role of schools. I read in one of your articles that you examined on the school that was in a museum.
Yes.
And one of the results was that they didn't get into the museum. Yes. So was probably better than me. But what does it mean for the relationship if you want to learn an ecosystem? If even happens if you take away the barriers?
That's a great characterization. Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, that's you build a little box called school inside a museum and people stand with it. Yeah. Schools are challenging. So the schools in the States right now are operating under a lot of pressures, and the need to have high-stakes assessments where if your kids aren't hitting a certain level of your school, they in fact be taken away from you and reorganized, and your teacher pay to be moved back, is something a lot of people are introducing into districts right now. So we've done a lot of work to try to bring the informal and the formal together, and they're speaking a completely different language about learning. We are not a top-down school system in the States, right? Everything is local control, and the local control is kind of super local because we elect school boards that kind of get to do what they want to change their mind every couple of years. So it's a real problem for us, but in a system where the funding and the directives come from the same place, where the informal and the schools could be affected by the same policies, I think that you're in a much stronger position to build an ecosystem quickly, because you won't have conflicting policy messages. And museums are told more and more people, more and more revenue. Schools are told you must meet these standards and you must focus more on instruction. So in fact, you do less school trips and you do less outside of school stuff. So those messages kind of are pulling people apart in a way that maybe in the Netherlands, where the government might have some control over both, you could think about crafting policy messages that put the two together. So I think it'll feel real different when you design your ecosystem. But in our work, you are right to say, we have always found anything school touches becomes school. And it just happens because school has such a strong sense of what it needs to do. So a lot of informal people isolate themselves from school so that they can be independent and creative. And the article you're talking about is attempts to bring the two together without violating the values and mission of each. It's hard.
It's very important. For Poland, it's very interesting because we have the same, not the same structure, but the same the same thing. Schools are very much about testing and results. So what the sense is the district that I talked about with in Dutch, about looking at the new curriculum, very interesting because things like curiosity, business are getting more central, but it means that you say that fundamental support, which level of funding will be essential to get the connection between schools and the informal. Any other questions?
I wondered if you learned anything in the research about the use of digital media and digital communication since there are a lot of the problems you mentioned, the borders, physical borders of the city and so I wondered if you learned anything about that.
So, not directly, but I can make something. So, many of the programs that we study, Pittsburgh's a technology town, lots of startup technology stuff there, and so it's a very technology-rich environment, both in schools and out of schools. And around the kids' use of technology, there has been less work that's tried to connect across places, but around teachers and parents, helping them to find the pathway. People are interested in using technology for that. We haven't really learned much that would surprise you about effective uses of technology within programs. What kinds of things do you think might be different with technology from a college perspective?
rough course, you can only teach about one thing. With the work, of course, in America is a problem. Yeah. So, for example, it's easier to choose your own path. But when you do have responsibility, there's a lot of physical stuff or personal relation. So it's upsides and downsides too, of course.
Yeah, that's good. It also makes me think that if you took a pathway perspective, you'd be less concerned if kids weren't always using authentic items. There's a time for the digital and a time for the authentic. Over time, we want them to do both. So there should be more continuity through the digital. Yeah, I think you're right. I'll get that.
Because one thing I always feel honest with the digital connection is that one thing that I think is really interesting is the sandbox idea from games. The idea that you are in a game, and in the other games like this, it looks like a free world, but actually it's not a free world. I think that we are somewhat some of us are in a free world, and we don't do that. But in the game, you have all these games inside games that you play knowledge. This is a pathway, which is not so much really your identity, and you want to know your pathway. I always have the idea, also feeling that this could be something or something like in our legal system.
So maybe also be the tool to get schools connected to the world around them. To get children, we used to do it actually, to get children put their questions on a digital media surrounding, and everybody around it could answer the questions. So the world opened up around it. I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, and it's a tool that helps you see the system as opposed to just the moment you're in, which is really the kind of thing. Yeah, good.
I have a question about your last sentence, about the vertical organizations. Can you tell something about the discussions or the talks you had with the maybe organizations in Pittsburgh, and what were the real convincing arguments to change your perspective from vertical to more like an ecosystem?
That's a good question. So, the things that are convincing first begin with the people. So this design fellow institution, it takes when you enter as a researcher into a practice context about 6 months before you're trusted. And because they were doing the work of the organization, they started being inside. And they clearly had a stake in the success of this organization. But they had to prove that. And they had to do research in a way that strengthened the organization's core work before the organization would listen to them about risky kind of partnerships in the public work. So what we found very successful, it's not persuasion as much as collaboration. And I think there really is an important piece for research practice work in these kinds of endeavors. Because researchers are good at seeing the system, but they're crappy about knowing what actual problems are being solved in a particular organization. So once we got the trust, and also these design fellows were talking to each other about their organizations, and there started being a bigger regional conversation about collaboration is going somewhere, that I think gets successful. And in Pittsburgh right now, there's a couple of backbone organizations that are trying to structure pathways, and the private foundations have begun to fund things that resonate with the backbone's mission. And so the funders getting behind this and being able to say, we don't need to see 100 survey results that were just like last year's 100 survey results to know if this is success. Instead, we want to either try something new that tells us something about how you're connected with organizations. So it's a very, it's evolving. It hasn't been solved. And it really is a collective sense that I think is going to change people's minds. There's a fear of getting left behind, right? If we're all doing this learning ecosystem thing, and I'm not. So we're also in this period where it's new enough that people will show up to a meeting and you say, hey, let's talk about ecosystems. Yeah, I've heard about that. Let's go to that meeting. But, yeah, I mean, hello. Right, sorry. Hello. Right. Sorry for the other tricks. But, in a couple of years, if all it is meetings to satisfy a funder or policymakers or stakeholder, and it doesn't actually feel right in your own practice, feels wrong. So I think that's where this kind of long-term commitment is really the best part.
Anybody else?
So you said something about curiosity and it being domain-specific. So I thought that was an important remark because I feel that we have some homework there. Could you say a little bit more about how you know that it is domain-specific?
I'm sorry, Amita, time's up. We're just out of here.
I was also wondering, a second question at the same time, like for instance, the domain of tinkering. You could easily think that a connection with art would be very well possible. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. So the claim that it's discipline-specific comes a lot out of the interest literature. So people have been studying how kids are interested in different topics. And that literature has clearly shown that if I'm interested in dinosaurs, that doesn't mean I'm interested in other parts of science necessarily. So this is this idea of the island of expertise, which becomes meaningful to me because of my activities, not because it corresponds to a certain discipline or destination in the world. And I'm not interested in things that I don't care about. So for this idea of momentum and pathways, and for people to feel that they have choice and autonomy about that, we think it's a reasonable starting hypothesis that this gets built in a context, in a historical context, and it's meaningful in a way that is really just pretty locally bounded. And as you come in maybe with a nature passion and you hit science in school, you could put those together and you could kind of see it from the other side, that there's this career pathway. But if you're a generally curious person who doesn't value life or good at science, I don't think there's any evidence to show that you're successful when you get to a higher stakes science content. And I think the informal world also builds these local interests in people. So it's nice that there's a diversity of organizations where it doesn't all feel the same. What art is like, what science is like, what history is like. So that you can develop individual profiles, different versions of that, which is certainly what we have seen in a lot of our interview studies. So that's why we say that. The idea of 21st century skills, I think, is interesting from a workforce perspective, but I think it's really difficult from an educational perspective because it's not clear to me that I can teach you to be a 21st century learner without you also learning something about science or art or history and wanting to be part of those communities as well. So we don't know for sure, we could be wrong, but I think it's a more productive stance for informal learning to make it about something, not just make it about some process of getting on a skill. What was the other part of the question?
Wait, can I ask a follow-up question on this? Because if I look at Leiden, or most places in Holland, and sometimes even local, so we talk about nature, which is the theme here. I think I can see a pathway in the nature organization. That's doable. But when we talk about history, there are 1 or 2 museums here, and maybe something, but then again, I mean, that's really small. There's a lot of good base to make this ecosystem. If you so how to solve something like that, it has to be local.
Yes. So the different disciplines or the different themes are going to have different resources. History, at least in the States, has an extraordinarily rich out-of-school footprint around things like reenactments, and also literature. People buy a lot of history, fictionalization, and movies and things like that. So there are fewer museums, but there may be some other ways that pathway like that could be built in. Egypt is an early interest for a lot of kids. Greek and Roman history. There's this series of books in the States now called Percy Jackson books. I don't know if you know Percy Jackson. You know, okay, so he's a kid, lives in New York, but he happens to also be the son of Poseidon. And he has all these Greek friends. It's kind of hard to learn about these gods. That has, it really is. They go to a school every year to learn how to be demigods and they have adventures in the world. That has gotten a lot of kids interested in classic history in a way that wasn't before. So I think you find it maybe from different things from what we do.
That's the question about the connection with art.
Oh, yeah, right. Sure. Tinkering in art. Karen has recently analyzed the art data. Can you just yell out some stuff about whether tinkering is an important part of the way art?
Looked at the passions for art sample. We found some interesting differences there in terms of a lot of, and we didn't discuss that in the passion sample. The scientists who could get through and get a career and not necessarily have a passion in the discipline. There's that motivation, interesting point in that sample. But in the art sample, you have to be pretty passionate to make it through the career. So we saw a much stronger presence of this, stronger career. Definitely there was crossover between the main motivation was passion for observation, and then passion for thinking was the second crossover in science. So it's understanding the properties of materials and understanding how to work with them. So that's our
Take one more question.
Did you also interview people who are not professors or scientists and ask them what they thought about or were interested in when they were kids?
Well, the artists are some of the people we've done, but we did not construct a comparison sample. And in part that's because we were asking about life history with science. And if you ask someone who hasn't had much history with science, it's very sure. But so what you're asking me and what I can't answer is what about the people who fall out, who started with a passion in science, but then for some reason or another did not go on to have a career in science. So we should construct a sample of people like that to understand something about how a passion interacts with their dynamics in the pathway. But
wondering if people who are, a bakery or who are driving a bus were also interested in dinosaurs or tinkering when they were kids. Of course, we shouldn't maybe judge that, but I was just wondering, aren't all children interested in dinosaurs?
Oh, no.
Well, I work here at Naturalis, of course, so that's the only thing I see.
We have done interviews of college students about what their real interest is, and other people who do lots of interviews with 5-year-old children about what their interests are. And it's pretty broad all over the map. There's a very strong sports-related kind of set of interests. There's a dance and kind of theater-related set of interests. And I think, part of what that work doesn't do is it shows me maybe 20% of the kids are interested in dinosaurs. I'm making that up, but it's definitely no more than 20%. Are really interested in dinosaurs. But when that interest doesn't catch fire and become a passion, it's pretty much a passing phase for them. So I don't even know if a really interest in dinosaurs has a life-transforming effect. And part of I think our work is, if you came to me and I had some easy way to say, she's a little bit interested in dinosaurs, maybe that's a really critical event. Maybe the ecosystem should rise up and say, you're a little bit interested? Come over here and we're going to do a thing in dinosaurs, and that might be the critical. You could go critical and become activated, but we don't even know because our kids just kind of float past us and know very little about their personal histories and their interests. So that, I think we could be more sensitive to kind of define that. So there's a lot of work to do.
Kevin, thank you very much for everything you said, especially the last words. This is very, very dear to me. I mean, with the possibility that if there are some kind of seed, how do you get them to stay interested and to follow your passion? And that's something that's, I think the pamphlet, you can also, I mean, the same is for teachers. Teachers take so much things they are offered, even for they don't know what's on the pamphlet problem. So I guess Marielle, you will introduce the thing out. So we have a break, but we will ask you to start doing the break with the next part. So, thank you very much.
So we thought not only listening but also working. So we have an assignment, and I'm going to start talking Dutch again now. Wat een beetje, misschien kwam mijn vraag daar ook vandaan over wat je nodig hebt om dat verticale te doorbreken. En ik hoor dat je in ieder geval een half jaar moet bouwen, in ieder geval aan vertrouwen. Dat half jaar hebben wij niet. We gaan om 4:30 ongeveer borrelen, dus in plaats van 3 kwartier moeten we